Welcome ladies and gentlemen to the best Last Valor build guide. This has been a heavily requested video and the wait is finally over. Hi, I'm Mon and let's get right into it, starting with the weapon features to understand how the weapon works in order to know how to build it. Starting with the first feature, hitting enemies 4 times triggers Shrapnel. Now what is Shrapnel? Shrapnel is a special ammo effect where it deals 50% attack, the multiplier for physical builds, as weapon damage to a different random part of the enemy. So if you hit the head of an enemy, Shrapnel cannot deal damage to that part of the body. Shrapnel can crit, strike weak spots, and will decay with distance. Now back to the weapon features, critical hits count as 2 hits for the first feature, meaning if you deal crit damage 2 times, you will trigger Shrapnel, because critical hits count as 2 hits for the counter of the first feature. Then, critical hits grant +1 shrapnel trigger times for 1 second. Now what this means is that if you deal a critical hit, then if you proc shrapnel in that instance of critical hit or in the next 1 second, you will deal 2 instances of shrapnel damage instead of only 1. And for the last feature, shrapnel crit damage plus 30%. So with all this in mind, we now know that Last Valor is a physical weapon, meaning weapon blueprint stars are important to increase its damage, and Last Valor will also be a crit based weapon. Now moving on to the calibration that you're going to want to run, you have 2 choices here. The first choice is rapid shot style, which increases your fire rate and reload speed at the cost of some attack percent. And the second choice is precision style, which increases your attack percent and range at the cost of some fire rate. Now they're both good, but when comparing the two of them, the better choice will be precision style. Note that this comparison shown on screen right now doesn't take into account range, since shrapnel and normal bullets have damage fall-offs. So if you're shooting at a target long range, precision style is even better. Moving on to the accessories, I'm running the large brake, the compact reflex sight, and the tactical combine grip for a good mix of stability, accuracy, and range. Of course, I'm using the extended rifle mag to have more bullets per mag, and as for the ammo, the best types of ammo to use will be smart rifle AP ammo, illusion rifle AP ammo, suppression rifle AP ammo, and penetration rifle AP ammo. Moving over to deviations that you'll want to use, you have 2 options. You have the Zap Cam, and you also have the Lone Wolf. Now they will both increase weapon damage received by attack targets, so for Lone Wolf at level 5 it's 43.2%, and Zap Cam at level 5 it is also 43.2%. However, Lone Wolf will be a bit better since it can draw aggro, and the other reason is because Lone Wolf has a Lunar Oracle variant, which grants a permanent 5% weapon damage bonus as long as you're synced with it, or 7.5%. Moving on to your secondary weapons to support your Last Valor, you have 3 options. You have the Bingo, the Wildfire, and the Recurve Crossbow. Now if you're only going to mark the enemy once, then you will find best results with the Recurve Crossbow. So hitting a weak spot will inflict the bullseye effect, which is 8% vulnerability on the enemy, which will increase your damage by 8%, and the crossbow will also give 15% crit rate. Now the crossbow can be annoying to use, since, well, each time you shoot with the crossbow, you will have to reload it, and you must hit a weak spot, otherwise you don't get these buffs. So the other best option would be the Bingo. The Bingo is really good because after switching to this weapon, the first hit is guaranteed to trigger the bullseye effect. It can give up to 45% weak spot damage bonus, and also if you defeat an enemy with a weak spot hit with the Bingo, you'll get 15% attack for 20 seconds, and all of these buffs will help the Last Valor massively. And lastly, for the worst option, that would be the Wildfire. Now sure, it is very comfortable to use since you get a lot of bullets per mag, however it will only give 25% weapon damage bonus. Now I know the last feature says when hitting a weak spot of marked enemies, attack plus 3%, which does buff bullet damage. However, this feature does not actually transfer once you swap out the Wildfire to the Last Valor, so you're only getting 25% weapon damage bonus and the bullseye proc. As for the melee weapon, the best option will be the Kukri. The Kukri is a weapon that is obtained from completing Prime Wars or just doing dungeons, and pretty much the reason why it's the best is because if you defeat a target with it, you'll gain 30% attack and 15% crit rate for 10 seconds, which is massive. Now to avoid defeating actual enemies with the Kukri, since that would take a very long time, what you want to do is make use of these ice cubes. And the way to get them is to get an ice pod deviation, since this will produce the ice cubes that you need. Now what you're going to want to do with these ice cubes is you're going to throw them on the ground, kill them with the kukri, and if I take a look at this, you'll see that I get 30% attack and 15% crit rate even if I'm equipping the last Valor. Moving over to the key gear you're going to want to wear, you have the gas tight helmet, the cage helmet, and the beret. And thanks to this side-by-side comparison, the gas tight helmet is the better option between the three, with the second one being beret and the worst option being the cage helmet. Now before I talk about the gear sets, if you're learning something new or wish to see more 1-2-man content, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the bell for any notifications. Also, let me know in the comments which build you'd like to see next, and with that, we continue forward to the gear sets. Now, if you want to deal the most amount of damage, then you're going to want to play the low HP gear set option, which would be wearing 3 treacherous tied pieces with 2 lone wolf pieces. So the 2 lone wolf pieces will give you magazine capacity and crit rate, whereas the 3 treacherous tied pieces will give you up to 50% weapon damage bonus as long as you fulfill the 2-piece and the 3-piece conditions, which are essentially keep your HP below 70% HP and keep your sanity low according to this sanity meter. And the way to keep your sanity low is by manually reducing it with a plethora of food items. Now, I'm not going to go over every single one, but for 2 examples, you can use spoiled food, which would reduce your sanity by 200 points per consumption, or dirty water, which reduces it by 300 points per consumption. Now, eating these 2 options will cause gastric discomfort, which can cause your character to vomit and will make your character lose weight continuously over time. And obviously, no one wants that to happen, so you're going to want to craft some antibiotics, which essentially heals that effect. And you only need to consume 1 antibiotic each time you decide to reduce your sanity all the way down to 0. Now, at the cost of damage, if you don't want to do the low HP playstyle, or if Lunar Oracle is going on, then you can instead run 4-piece Lone Wolf with 1-piece Renegade. The Renegade piece will give you reload speed bonus, and as for the Lone Wolf pieces, well, the 3-piece will give you up to 48% crit damage bonus, the 4-piece will add 12% more of crit damage bonuses, and a temporary crit rate of 8% for 2 seconds after reloading. Now, as for the mask hide that you're going to want to use, if the enemy has a lot of weak spots, then you're going to want to use Lunar Wolfskin, which is a base 4% weak spot damage bonus, which gets upgraded to 12% if your HP is below 30%. However, if the enemy doesn't have a lot of weak spots, you're going to want to use Golden Wool for the 1 to 12% weapon damage bonus, which fluctuates every second. Moving on to Cradle perks, you're going to want to have Anti-Void for the rifle damage bonus and for the damage bonus against void anomalies. Then you're going to want Tactical Combo for the weapon damage bonus. You're also going to want Deadly Combo and Invincible Strike for the Shrapnel linked buffs. Then you'll want Mark Strike for the weak spot damage bonus against marked enemies. You'll also want Bounty Hunter for the weapon damage bonus after marking targets. Then you will want Chaotic Thoughts for the damage reduction and for the damage bonus against any type of enemy in the game. And lastly, Deviant Energy Defense for the survivability, which of course is given by the shield that this Cradle perk gives. Moving over to the food buffs, starting with the food slot, you're going to want to eat Mixed Fried Hot Dog. It is increased damage against marked enemies, which counts as X-type multiplier, and you don't have a lot of that, so this is going to be the best option. Now, as for the drink slot, there currently isn't any drinks that will buff this weapon's damage, so just go with any movement drink of your choice. So for instance, Stardust Mushroom Soup. Moving over to Suffix and Substats priority, starting with the weapon mod, you're going to want to go with Shrapnel Suffix. As linked attribute, you're going to want to look for Shrapnel crit damage bonus, and as general attribute, look for 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemies. Now, Shrapnel trigger chance is absolutely useless since the last Valor doesn't work off of trigger chance, and the Shrapnel weak spot damage can be good. However, if your normal bullets are already hitting the weak spot, you will not benefit from this stat unless if the enemy has multiple weak spots. So I usually don't really like Shrapnel weak spot damage bonus since it won't always work. At the exception of one single enemy in the game where Shrapnel weak spot damage is insanely strong, and that would be the EX1 final boss. And the reason for this is because on that boss, Shrapnels will always automatically target his weak spots, so you will always benefit from Shrapnel weak spot damage bonus. Then, for the helmet and for the top mod, you're gonna ideally want to run a lunar suffix, but if you don't have lunar mods, then of course you're gonna want to run violent mods. Now the reason why we go with lunar suffix mods is because naturally they scale higher than your violent mods. As a matter of fact, they scale 2 times that amount, so lunar gives 30% crit damage and 12% weapon damage bonus at maximum value, whereas violent gives 15 and 6, which is, half of what lunar gives. Now sure, lunar does require you to stay at low HP, but you don't have to stay at really low HP. Already at around 70% HP value, you are already gaining more than a violent suffix mod. Then for everything else, you're going to want to go with violent suffix. And as linked attribute, you're going to want to look for weapon damage bonus, and as general attribute, look for 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemy. Now the reason why we won't want to go with a shrapnel suffix for the mask mod will be explained once I talk about the mask mod itself. Now before talking about mods to run, I just want to share that if you aren't sure how mods work or how and where to get them, then I've got this mod spreadsheet for you to check out. Every mod in the game is in there, and the link will be in the description and pinned comment. And now let's start with the last Valor mods. So the best mod to use is going to be Shrapnel Smash, which is triggering Shrapnel grants Shrapnel crit rate plus 2% for 2 seconds. Effect is reset each time you trigger Shrapnel and can stack up to 15 times. And this is the best option. Now there is the less reload or no reload build, which would involve you in using Shrapnel Souvenir, which is when Shrapnel hits a weak spot, automatically refills 1 bullet from inventory to your magazine. However, it is still less strong than if you just want pure damage source, which would be Shrapnel Smash. Then, of course, there's Shatter Them All, which is 15% shrapnel damage bonus per shrapnel hit part. So you're going to benefit the most out of this mod if you use the Beret key gear. However, even when comparing Beret with Shatter Them All and Beret with Shrapnel Smash, or just any key gear, Shrapnel Smash will still come out on top. Then lastly, there is Shield Breaker, which is when hitting a shielded enemy, shrapnel damage plus 60% for 1 second. Now, this is a lot of shrapnel damage bonus. However, once you break an enemy shield, which is like this small white bar, this mod stops working, so it's pretty horrible. Now for the secondary weapons mod, you're going to want to use Vulnerability Amplifier to add an extra 8% of vulnerability to increase your overall damage. Then for the melee mod, it really doesn't matter, but I'm using Melee Amplifier, which increases the melee damage by 12%. Now moving over to the helmet mod, you have 3 options. You have Weapon Symphony, you have Momentum Up, and you have Fateful Strike. Now if the enemy you're shooting at does not have any weak spot, so for instance the fridge in the silo, then Fateful Strike is the best mod to use. However, if it does have weak spots, then you're going to want to consider using Momentum Up or Weapon Symphony. Now, if you don't swap between your secondary weapon often, then you're going to want to use Momentum Up for the 10% fire rate for the first 50% of your magazine and 30% weapon damage for the next 50% of your magazine. However, if you often swap between your secondary weapons and your main weapon, then you're going to want to consider Weapon Symphony because it gives 10% fire rate and 25% weapon damage bonus the moment you swap weapons. Now this effect does decrease by 10% of its original effect per second, up to a maximum decrease of 60%. So if the enemy isn't too tanky, so for instance it doesn't survive for longer than 4 or 5 seconds, then Weapon Symphony will be great because you'll still benefit from a lot of its effect. Now for the mask mod, you have 2 options, but the main mod that you will actually want to use is going to be Targeted Strike, which is when hitting marked enemies, crit rate plus 10% and crit damage plus 25%, which is really good. And this is kind of the reason why we don't want to use a Shrapnel Suffix, because it's just impossible to use Shrapnel Suffix on a Bullseye mod, since Targeted Strike is a mod linked to Bullseye weapons. However, if you're just clearing overworld content and you're not even going to bother marking, then sure, you can use Explosive Shrapnel, which is the 20th Shrapnel is explosive and deals plus 300% damage as a critical hit. Moving on to the gloves mod, you have 2 options. You have Crit Amplifier, which is crit rate plus 10% and crit damage plus 15%, or crit boost, which would be crit rate plus 15%. Now, due to the fact that crit damage is a stat that's really easy to get, you would preferably want to run crit boost due to the lack of crit rate compared to crit damage. But of course, if you don't have crit boost, or if your crit boost is way worse than your crit amplifier, then do consider using crit amp. Moving over to the boots mod, Rush Hour is the mod you're going to want to use if you play the low HP gear set option. And the reason for this is because every 10% HP loss grants 4% weapon damage bonus, and since you're going to be reducing your sanity to 0%, you will permanently get 24% weapon damage bonus. However, if you're not doing the low HP playstyle, or if you don't have a good rush hour, then definitively run Covered Advance, as between all of the other mods, Covered Advance is either less conditional or straight up gives more buffs. Since its effect is taking no damage for only 4 seconds, grants 20% weapon damage bonus, which lasts for 30 seconds. So it's a really good option. Now for the top mod, just go with any gold mod that is of Lunar Suffix with the best substats line, ideally triple gold. And even if you're not using Lunar, just use a Violent Suffix, which once again has the best substats. Then lastly, moving over to the pants mod, you have two options. You've got Deadshot and you have Bullet Siphon. The best mod to use is Deadshot because it stacks to a very high percentage of 45% crit damage bonus. So if we read the description, it's each crit hit by non-melee weapons grants plus 5% crit damage up to 45%. And Bullet Siphon is weapon damage bonus, and it'll only give up to 25% weapon damage bonus. So Bullet Siphon would be a mod that you'd use if you don't have Deadshot. This is it for this guide. If you learned something and wish to see more Once Human content, then make sure to have liked this video, subscribed to my channel, and turned on the bell for any notifications. Feel free to ask your questions down in the comments below. This is Mon. Peace out.